at you. Who'd ever want you now?
He's right. I would.
She's carrying my baby. And tomorrow, your company belongs to her.
What did you do?
Hook dialogue. She is my ex-wife. We are very close. Close enough that I can tell you she has let herself go completely since the divorce. Pre-story summary. Nora Calloway walked into that gala thinking the hardest part of her evening would be the small talk. She was wrong. What she did not know was that the man who heard her ex-husband humiliate her, the quiet one near the bar, the one who almost stepped in and then did not, was the same man she was carrying a secret about. Marcus Hale had built half of Manhattan's financial district and trusted almost no one. Derek Calloway had spent 2 years trying to get a meeting with him, and Derek had no idea that the woman he had just insulted in front of a room full of people was the one thread connecting him to everything he wanted and everything he was about to lose. Chapter 1. The Gala, the Remark, and the Witness. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was exactly the kind of event Nora Calloway had learned to get through on autopilot. You smiled when someone made eye contact. You asked questions you already knew the answers to. You held your glass of sparkling water and hoped no one noticed it was not champagne. You wore the right dress, said the right things to the right people, and counted the minutes until you could reasonably call for your car without it looking like you were fleeing. She had gotten good at this over the past 2 years, not the events themselves. She had always been decent at events, but the specific art of being present without being exposed, of moving through a room full of people who knew her as Derek Calloway's ex-wife and not giving any of them a reason to update that description with something worse. Tonight she was wearing navy, a wrap style, well-fitted, chosen that morning after 20 minutes in front of the mirror. She was 15 weeks along, and in certain lights, at certain angles, there was a softness to her midsection that she was still learning to read from the outside. She had stood in front of that mirror, trying to determine whether a stranger would notice. She had decided the answer was no. She had put on her earrings and called her car. The Whitmore Foundation was one of her firm's oldest clients, not large, but steady, and the kind of institutional connection that mattered in her industry. Attendance at their annual gala was not optional. She had come every year for the past 6 years, first as Derek's wife and then, for the last 2, as herself. She generally preferred herself. The conversations were shorter, and she did not have to spend the drive home debriefing someone else's networking agenda. She had arrived at 7:30, worked the room for 90 minutes with reasonable efficiency, and had almost made it to the end of the evening without incident. Almost. She was standing near the east windows, half listening to a conversation between 2 architects she vaguely knew from a project a couple of years back when she felt it. That particular shift in the air that meant Derek was nearby. She had lived with the man for 4 years. She knew his approach the way you know a weather change before the clouds actually arrive. Something in the atmosphere went flat. She turned before he reached her. He looked good. She noticed that with the detached clarity she had worked hard to develop, he had always known how to wear a tuxedo. His hair was still dark, still cut close at the sides the way he liked it, and he was smiling the way he smiled at industry events. Warm on the surface, measuring underneath, the kind of smile that had taken her an embarrassingly long time to learn to read correctly. Nora. He said her name like a greeting and a verdict at the same time. Derek. She kept her tone exactly level. He glanced at the 2 architects she had been talking to, then back at her, and something shifted behind his eyes. The small internal calculation she had spent 4 years learning to recognize too late. He stepped slightly to the side, the kind of move that looked casual and was not, repositioning himself so that the cluster of people nearby could hear the conversation without it appearing deliberate. She knew what was coming. She had about 3 seconds to decide whether to walk away before it started. She stayed, because walking away first had always been the thing Derek expected her to do, and she had gotten tired of giving him what he expected. "It is good to see you," he said, and he sounded like he meant it, which was always the most dangerous version of Derek. "You look different." "But well," Nora said nothing. He turned slightly toward the couple standing nearest to them, the half-turn of someone including others in a pleasant exchange. "She is my ex-wife," he said, his voice carrying the easy warmth of a man sharing something affectionate. "We are very close, close enough that I can tell you she has let herself go completely since the divorce." The woman next to him produced a short, uncomfortable laugh, the sound people make when they are not sure if something is a joke and do not want to be caught not laughing if it is. The man beside her found something interesting to look at near the floor. One of the architects Nora had been talking to took a small step back, the physical language of someone who wants to not be part of something they can already see is wrong. Nora felt the words land. She felt them the way you feel cold water when you are not expecting it, the shock of contact first, and then the slow spread of it through your whole body. She was aware of the specific cruelty of the timing. She was wearing a dress she had chosen carefully. She was standing in a room full of people in her industry. She was 15 weeks pregnant and had spent 20 minutes that morning trying to determine whether it showed. Now she had her answer delivered in public by the one person in the room who had enough history with her body to make the observation land exactly as hard as he intended. She held Derek's gaze for 2 full seconds. Not aggressive, not wounded, just present, looking at him steadily, letting him see that she had heard him and that she was not going to perform either distress or indifference for his benefit. Then she said, quietly and without raising her voice, "You have always been better at describing me than knowing me, Derek." She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked toward the far end of the room, not fast, not slow, with the specific deliberate pace of someone who has decided that the last word of the evening is not going to belong to the person who just tried to take it. She did not cry. She had made herself a promise somewhere around month 3 of the divorce proceedings, when she had cried in the bathroom of a restaurant while Derek ate dinner 12 feet away and felt nothing about it. The promise was simple. No more tears in rooms where he might be able to calculate their effect. She had kept it. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that a man standing near the bar, roughly 10 feet from where Derek had delivered his performance, had heard every single word. Marcus Hale was not, by nature, someone who got pulled into other people's conflicts. He had learned early that the fastest way to make dangerous enemies in his industry was to involve yourself publicly in situations that were not yours, and the fastest way to expose your own thinking was to react visibly to things that made you angry. He had spent 15 years building a reputation for being difficult to read, and that reputation had served him better than almost anything else he had built in the same period. But he had been watching Derek Calloway's face while the man was talking, and he had seen something there that he recognized with unpleasant clarity. Not cruelty exactly, something more deliberate than cruelty, the specific expression of a person who is aware of exactly what they are doing and is taking quiet satisfaction in the precision of it, the expression of someone who has chosen their words not in anger but in calculation, who knows where the bruise is and is pressing on it with measured force. Marcus knew that expression. He had seen it before, on a different face, in a different city, and the last time he had seen it, the person wearing it had cost him 18 months of his life, and a substantial portion of his trust in his own judgment about people. He set his glass down on the bar. He had taken 3 steps toward Derek Calloway when he saw Nora turn and begin walking away. He stopped. She was moving at an even pace, shoulders back, not performing anything in either direction. She was not rushing, and she was not doing the stiff, controlled walk of someone holding themselves together by force. She was just walking, the way someone walks when they have made a decision and the decision is finished. There was a quality to it that was hard to name exactly. What he saw was specific, the movement of someone who had decided that what just happened was not going to be the defining thing about this evening, and was enacting that decision with her entire body. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned back to the bar, but his eyes tracked her path across the room for another 30 seconds before he made himself look elsewhere. He knew who she was. He had known before tonight. Elena Park, one of his most reliable senior project managers, had mentioned Nora Calloway several times over the past year, and Marcus, because he was constitutionally incapable of meeting anyone without first understanding the shape of their professional history, had looked her up. Interior designer. Her own firm for 2 years. Before that, a senior position at one of the better commercial design firms in the city. The Whitmore lobby was the work of hers he knew best. He had bought the building partly for other reasons, but the lobby had been a factor. It had a quality of attention to it that was hard to manufacture. Whoever designed it had cared about more than the brief. He had also seen the name Derek Calloway in the divorce records, which were public, and had noted that the ex-husband ran a mid-sized investment group called the Caldwell Group that had been trying to get a meeting with Hale Capital for approximately 2 years. Marcus had no strong feelings about the Caldwell Group either way. He had simply never had a reason to move the proposal forward. Standing at that bar, watching the back of Nora Calloway's head as she made her way across the room, he thought about that proposal. He thought about Derek Calloway's face while he was speaking. He thought about the specific calculated pause before the word different. It was Elena who introduced them 40 minutes later, near the coat check. She appeared at Marcus's elbow with Nora beside her and said, "Without ceremony, Marcus, this is Nora Calloway. She designed the Whitmore lobby. Nora Marcus Hale. He bought the building." Nora extended her hand. She had dark eyes and the kind of composed expression that did not look assembled. It looked like her resting state. He shook her hand. "I have admired that space for 2 years," he said. "That is kind of you." Her voice was even. Nothing in her face suggested that less than an hour ago she had been standing 10 feet from where they were now, absorbing something in front of strangers. "The lobby was one of the reasons I moved on the building when it came available," he said. "I do not usually say that to designers. I am saying it because it is true." Something shifted in her expression, small, contained, but real. She had not known he had bought it. The information had landed. Elena, with her unerring instinct for other people's conversations, had already half-turned towards someone across the room. Within 60 seconds, she had drifted away entirely, leaving the two of them in a silence that should have been awkward but was not quite. There was something in the way it settled between them, unhurried, not strained, that felt less like the absence of things to say and more like a mutual decision not to manufacture conversation, just to fill space. "The Whitmore lobby took 8 months, Nora said eventually. Not quite looking at him, looking somewhere between him and the middle distance. The way people look when they are saying something they have been thinking about for longer than the moment requires. 8 months and more arguments about the light fixtures than I would care to count. I am glad the space held up." "It more than held up," Marcus said. She looked at him directly for just a moment. Then she said, "I should find my coat. and he said, "Of course," and she moved toward the counter. Elena reappeared at his shoulder. She designed the Whitmore lobby. Elena said again, quieter, "You mentioned that. I mention it because you have a photograph of it on your desk, and you have never told me why." Marcus said nothing. Elena studied him for a moment with the frank, assessing look that had made her indispensable to him over 3 years. Then someone called her name and she was gone. He collected his coat and walked out into the cold. His driver pulled the car forward. Marcus got in and sat back, and for several minutes he did none of the things he normally did in the back of a car. He did not take out his phone. He did not check messages or review anything. He just sat. He thought about the way Nora Calloway had walked away from Derek, the quality of the decision in it. He thought about the 8 months and the light fixtures and the way she had said it, not proud, not performing the memory, just stating it like something that was true and worth saying. His phone buzzed. His head of business development, confirming that the Caldwell Group's proposal had been sitting in the review queue for 22 months, awaiting a signal to proceed or decline. Marcus looked at the message for a long moment. Then he put his phone face down on the seat beside him and looked out the window at the city. He thought about Derek Calloway's face, the deliberate pause, the smile that had stayed perfectly in place the entire time. He did not respond to the message, not yet. 40 blocks south, in the back of her own car, Nora had her hand resting flat against her stomach. Not rubbing circles, just her palm flat present. The city moved past the window in streaks of light and dark. She was looking at it without really seeing it. She had a prenatal appointment on Thursday. She had been going alone every time, and she had a set of reasons for that which she had rehearsed thoroughly enough that they almost felt like convictions. She was 15 weeks along. The father was a man she had seen 7 times, and the circumstances of how she had gotten here were complicated in the way that life after a bad marriage tends to be complicated, not scandalous, just human and somewhat difficult to explain. She had been telling herself for 3 weeks that she was going to call Marcus Hale and have the conversation. She kept finding reasons to wait. The reasons were not dishonest. She genuinely was not sure what to say or how to say it or what she expected the conversation to produce. She was not trying to get anything from him that was important to her, more important than it probably needed to be. But the years with Derek had left her with a hypervigilance about appearing to want something she was not entitled to. What she was afraid of, if she was being honest with herself, was that she would tell him and he would assume she had an angle, that he would look at her the way Derek had trained her to expect people to look at her when she needed something, like someone doing the math. She took her hand off her stomach. She got out her phone, looked at the reminder from her doctor's office, confirming Thursday's appointment, and put it away again. Derek's voice moved through her head, uninvited. She let it pass through without attaching to it. She was better at this than she used to be. The car turned uptown. Nora sat quietly with her hands in her lap and watched the city do what it always did. Keep moving, keep going, utterly indifferent to anyone's particular evening, and found, in that indifference, something that had always been a strange comfort to her. Nobody in this city was keeping score of her. Only Derek had ever believed he had that right, and Derek was not the last word on anything. Not tonight, not anymore. She got out at her building, thanked her driver, and walked upstairs alone. She washed her face, put on the oversized t-shirt she had been sleeping in for 2 months, and went to bed. She did not let herself think about the man at the coat check until she was inside with the door locked behind her. And then she only let herself think about him for a moment, the photograph on his desk, the lobby he had bought the building partly for, the way the silence between them had settled without either of them forcing it. Then she closed her eyes and let the day go. Chapter 2: The apartment, the photograph, and what he did not explain. The prenatal appointment on Thursday took 45 minutes and confirmed what Nora already knew: everything was fine. The baby was measuring on track, the heartbeat was strong, and Dr. Reyes told her she could expect to start feeling movement within the next few weeks. Nora thanked her, scheduled the next appointment, and walked out into the Thursday morning cold with her hands in her coat pockets and the particular feeling she always had after these visits, something between relief and loneliness and a stubborn private tenderness she had not found a name for yet. She took the subway back to her studio in the Flatiron district. She sat with her tote bag in her lap and her earbuds in and let the train carry her downtown, and she thought about the week ahead. Her assistant Jamie, 26 years old, excellent coffee, organizational instincts of someone twice her age, looked up when Nora arrived and said, "Elena Park called. Said it is not urgent, but could you call her back today?" Also, a new commission inquiry came in this morning through the website. Residential, Upper East Side. The contact name is Hale. Nora stopped taking off her coat. "Hale," she said, "that is what it says." No first name in the inquiry form, just Hale and a property address on East 73rd. There is a phone number for someone named Claire who says she is the property manager. Should I respond? Nora finished taking off her coat. She hung it on the rack by the door and stood there for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Tell Claire I am available Thursday of next week for an initial walkthrough." She went to her desk and pulled up the property address. East 73rd, between Park and Lexington. The building had sold 8 months ago. She already knew. She had known from the moment Jamie said the name. She called Elena. Elena picked up on the second ring. "I was going to ask if you had gotten the inquiry," Elena said, skipping the greeting the way she always did. "But I can tell from your voice you already know what it is." "Whose apartment is it, Elena?" "His." "Why did he not reach out directly?" "Because he is Marcus Hale and he does not do anything directly if he can do it properly instead. He asked me for a recommendation 2 weeks ago. I gave him 3 names. He chose yours. I am telling you this because I want you to have the full picture, not because I am lobbying you either way." Nora looked at the property address, still open on her screen. 2 weeks ago, she said. 2 weeks ago was before the gala, before the coat check, before the conversation about the lobby. He had already looked her up, already made a decision, before they had exchanged a single word directly. "How is he to work with?" Nora asked. Elena considered this. Exacting. Clear about what he wants, but genuinely open to being shown something better if you can make the case for it. He does not micromanage, but he notices everything. He is a fair person, Nora. That is the most useful thing I can tell you. A fair person. Coming from Elena, who had worked with Marcus for 3 years and was not given to generous characterizations of anyone, that was something. "I will do the walkthrough," Nora said. The walkthrough was on a Thursday morning. She arrived at the East 73rd Street building at 9, met Claire, and was taken up to the apartment on the 14th floor. She was walking through the main living space, taking measurements and photographs and mental notes, when she heard the elevator and then the sound of the apartment door. She kept measuring. "The south-facing rooms get better light than I expected," she said, without turning around. "It surprised me too," Marcus said, "the first time I saw it." She finished the measurement, wrote it down, and turned around. He was in a charcoal suit, no tie, the jacket over one arm. He was looking around the room the way people look at spaces they own but do not yet fully inhabit. "I did not know you were coming in person," she said. "Claire mentioned you were here." "I was close by." He set his jacket over the back of a chair. "I will stay out of your way. You are not in my way. But if you are here, you might as well tell me what you actually want the space to do." The inquiry form was thorough, but it was careful. Careful usually means there is something that did not make it into the form. He looked at her for a moment. I wanted to feel like somewhere a person actually lives, he said. I have owned apartments that looked like showrooms. I am not interested in that anymore. How long have you been in your current place? 7 years. And before that, a different apartment that also looked like a showroom. I have been good at acquiring spaces, and not particularly good at inhabiting them. Nora wrote something in her notebook, not about the apartment, about the way he said inhabiting, like it was a skill he was aware of not having. Any restrictions? She asked. Materials, colors, anything you know you do not want? Nothing that looks like it was chosen to impress someone who is not there. She nodded and moved into the second bedroom. She was halfway through her notes when she stopped. There was a document folder on the narrow ledge below the window. It was open to a property schematic. In the corner of the schematic, someone had paper-clipped a photograph, not a photograph of the apartment, a photograph of a building lobby, specifically the lighting installation above the reception desk, a cascading series of hand-blown glass fixtures she had spent 3 weeks sourcing and 2 arguments with the general contractor getting approved, the Whitmore lobby. She stood there looking at it for a moment. It was not a promotional photograph. This was taken at an angle nobody chose for promotional purposes. It was taken by someone standing just inside the entrance, looking up and slightly left, which was the angle at which the fixtures caught the morning light, and did something particular that she had intended, and then been quietly delighted to find had actually worked. It was the angle of someone who had stood in that lobby and looked up and taken a photograph because they wanted to remember specifically what they were seeing. She turned around. Marcus was in the doorway. She held up the schematic with the photograph clipped to it. I bought the building, he said. The lobby was one of the reasons. I told you that. You told me that at the coat check, she said. You did not tell me you had a photograph of it. He looked at the photograph, then at her. I took it about 6 months before I bought the building, he said. I walk into a lot of spaces, most of them I forget by the time I reach the sidewalk. That one I kept thinking about. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because someone made a decision about the light, he said. Not the safe decision, the decision that was actually right. And it required either knowing that it would work or being willing to be wrong about it. In my experience, that kind of decisions is rarer than it should be. Nora set the schematic down carefully on the ledge. It took me 3 weeks to find the right glassmaker, she said, and the general contractor told me twice it would not work structurally. He was wrong. I know, Marcus said. You can tell, looking at it. She turned back to her notebook. She had 3 more rooms to measure. She was aware that something had shifted in the quality of the air in the apartment. She was also aware that she was 15 weeks pregnant, and that the man in the doorway was the reason, and that she had been telling herself for 3 weeks that she was going to have a specific conversation. This moment was not that moment, but the conversation was getting harder to postpone. The second bedroom, she said, keeping her voice steady. Do you have a specific use in mind for it? Guest room, office, both? I have been thinking about that, Marcus said. Leave it flexible for now. She wrote that down. She had seen the note in the property file from his previous instruction, convert to child's room, and she did not write that down. She wrote leave flexible and moved on. In the elevator going down, he said, I would like to see a preliminary direction before we commit to a full scope. Not a proposal, just a conversation about where you would start and why. I can have something to talk through in 2 weeks, she said. Good. On the sidewalk, he stopped. I will be honest with you. I looked into your work before I asked Elena for recommendations. The Whitmore lobby was already on my list of things I had seen in this city that I thought were worth paying attention to. That is not something I say to be flattering. I say it because I think you should know the starting point. Nora looked at him. The morning was cold and bright. She thought about the photograph, the angle he had chosen, the words he had used. Someone made a decision about the light. I appreciate that, she said. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she confirmed. She walked toward the subway entrance on the corner. She did not look back, but she was smiling slightly, not at him, not for anyone. Just the small involuntary expression of a person who has just had a conversation that left them feeling more like themselves than they had expected. She thought, I have to tell him, soon, before this goes any further in any direction. That evening, Derek Calloway sat in his office on the 32nd floor and read an email from his assistant. The Hale Capital meeting request had gone unanswered for the 3rd week in a row. His assistant had used the phrase still pending review, which was the professional language for being ignored. Derek closed the email. He had been trying to get a meeting with Hale Capital for 22 months. His fund was struggling. The numbers were not catastrophic yet, but they were trending in a direction that made certain conversations with certain institutional clients increasingly uncomfortable, and he needed something to change the story. Hale Capital would change the story. He had seen Nora at the Whitmore Gala 6 days ago and had not stopped thinking about it. Not with guilt. Derek was not substantially given to guilt, but with a particular restless quality he recognized as miscalculation. He had meant to remind her of her place, and instead she had looked at him with those even dark eyes and said one sentence and walked away. And somehow he had come out of the exchange feeling like the one who had been handled. He did not like that feeling. He turned back to his desk. He pulled up his contacts and found the number for a journalist he had done a favor for 18 months ago. The kind of favor that could be called in. He picked up his phone. He made the call. Nora, at that exact moment, was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and the preliminary sketches for the Hale apartment spread out in front of her. She was drawing light sources. She was thinking about what a person who had said, I have been good at acquiring spaces and not particularly good at inhabiting them, might need from a room to start feeling like it was his. She worked until 10:30, then she cleaned up her sketches, washed her cup, and went to bed. She was almost asleep when she remembered she still had not called Marcus to tell him the things she needed to tell him. She told herself she would do it soon. She told herself that every night, Chapter 3, dinner, the wall, and the story that ran overnight. The preliminary direction meeting was supposed to last an hour. It lasted 2.5. They met at the studio. Marcus arrived on time and spent the first 4 minutes looking at the boards without saying anything, which she had not expected but immediately respected. Most clients started talking the moment they walked in. His silence was the real thing. He was actually looking the second direction, he said finally. Tell me about the starting point, she told him. He listened. He asked 3 questions, each more specific than the last. He pushed back once on her choice of a particular stone for the kitchen, and she made her case, and he considered it and said simply, You are right. I was wrong about that. No qualification, no softening, just a straight acknowledgement, the kind she had almost forgotten was possible from someone with money and opinions. By noon, they had worked through all 3 directions and settled on a path forward. They kept talking. The conversation moved from the apartment to the broader question of what Nora thought about the relationship between function and feeling in residential work. Did you always know you wanted to do this? Marcus asked. Run my own firm? Yes. No, she said. I was good at it before I knew I wanted it. The wanting came later when I understood what I was actually doing. I think that is how it works for most people. You discover the want by doing the thing, not the other way around. He looked at her. What changed between being good at it and wanting it on your own terms? My marriage ended, she said. And when I was figuring out what was left of my life, I realized the only things I was completely certain about were the ones I had done entirely by my own judgment. The Whitmore lobby was one of them. I fought for every decision in that space. No one else's name is on it. He was quiet for a moment, and that mattered. It mattered more than I knew at the time. I understood it afterward. Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy, something more specific. Recognition. The look of someone who has arrived at a similar understanding by a different road. I had a business partner in my late 20s, he said. Someone I trusted completely. Turned out he had been running a parallel set of conversations with a competitor for most of our partnership, using information from our work. The damage was not financial. I rebuilt the financial part. The damage was that I had been completely wrong about someone I thought I knew well, and I had been wrong because I wanted to believe what he was showing me. How long did it take you to trust your own judgment again? Nora asked. I am still working on it, he said, and then quietly, that is probably more information than the meeting required, I asked, she said. He looked at her directly. There was a quality to the silence that followed, something with weight to it, a little heat, the kind of silence that means something different on both sides, and both parties know it. He left at 2 o'clock. At the door, he paused. I would like to continue this conversation, not about the apartment, Nora said. That sounds like you are asking me to dinner. I am. Thursday. There is a place in the West Village I like. Quiet. Good food. No one I know goes there, which is usually a recommendation in itself. She said yes. She also told herself she would tell him at dinner. No more waiting. Thursday evening she worked until 6. Went home, changed into something that fit differently now than it had 2 months ago, and went to dinner. The restaurant was small and warm, tucked into a side street in the West Village that she did not know. Marcus was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table. He stood when he saw her. She noted this without comment. They ordered. For the first part of the meal they talked about the apartment, briefly, and then, by unspoken mutual agreement, they stopped talking about the apartment. Tell me something about where you grew up, she said. Ohio, he said. A mid-sized city, nothing remarkable about it. My father sold insurance. My mother taught high school English. Neither of them understood what I do now, exactly, but they understood working hard and being honest about what things cost. In our house, if you wanted something, you were expected to be clear-eyed about what it was going to require. No one told you not to want things. They just expected you to tell the truth about them. That sounds healthy, Nora said. It was. I did not know how healthy until I spent time in rooms full of people who had never been asked to tell the truth about what they wanted. She smiled. Finance will do that. Finance in general. But yes. He leaned back slightly. Where did you grow up? Connecticut. My parents were both academics. My father was a literature professor. My mother was in art history. They thought in terms of significance. Everything had to mean something. A meal was not a meal. It was a statement about values. They were wonderful, actually. I am making it sound more exhausting than it was. But I learned very early that the way things look and the way things feel are never entirely separate. I just did not know until much later that I could make a career of that belief. You make it sound inevitable in retrospect. Most things do, she said. That is the trick your memory plays on you. He was watching her with the full attention that she was beginning to understand was just how he listened. Completely, without the small distractions most people allowed themselves. Derek had listened like a man waiting for the part that related to him. Marcus listened like someone who was genuinely interested in the part that did not. 2 hours in, over coffee, Marcus said, "There is something I want to say about the gala." Nora went still. "I was nearby when Derek spoke to you," he said, "close enough to hear it. I did not intervene because you were clearly handling it, and I have learned the hard way that stepping into someone else's situation without being asked is usually about the person stepping in, not the person they think they are helping. But I want you to know I heard it, and I want you to know what I thought about it." "What did you think?" she asked. Her voice was steady. "I thought about the last person I saw make a calculation like that, choosing words that precisely, with that particular smile, and I thought about what that kind of person costs the people around them. And I thought that whatever he believed he was accomplishing by saying that, he was wrong." She looked at him across the small table. "He has been wrong about a lot of things," she said. "He just has very good posture while he is being wrong. It makes it harder to see." Marcus almost smiled. "I know the type." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She was aware that the moment was here, that she had told herself she would say it at dinner, that this specific conversation, with its specific honesty on both sides, was the right context. She took a breath. "There is something I have been meaning to tell you," she said. "Something I should have said before now. The reason I did not was..." His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and said, "I am sorry, 1 second. It is my COO. He would not call if it was not something." "Of course," she said. He stepped away from the table. She sat with her coffee and the half-finished sentence and the familiar weight of the moment having passed. She could feel it moving away from her the way a window closes, not slammed, just settled back into its frame. He came back 3 minutes later. "I am sorry. Where were you?" She looked at him. The sentence was still there. She could still say it, and then she heard herself say instead, "The Whitmore lobby was the last thing I finished before the marriage ended, before everything fell apart. I think that is why I care about it so much. It was the last thing I made entirely for myself." She watched him receive this. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. And the part she had kept back sat in her chest like a held breath. "Then it is the right place for it to be," he said. "Somewhere it will be looked at." She nodded. She finished her coffee. He walked her to the corner, and they said goodnight in the way that meant something more than the words, and she got into a cab and rode uptown and thought, "I have to tell him, before anything else happens." Next time. No more waiting. The article ran at 6:47 the next morning. She saw it on her phone before she was fully awake. A piece in a media column suggesting that Callaway Studio had been quietly passed over for several significant commissions in recent months, and that industry sources described the firm as struggling to find its footing since the divorce. The piece mentioned, in its third paragraph, that the firm had recently been considered and declined by a high-profile residential client, no name given, for a project on the Upper East Side. The Upper East Side project was the Hale apartment. She knew it immediately. Nobody else knew about that commission except Jamie, Elena, Marcus, and his property manager, Claire. The article had the detail wrong. She had not been declined. She had been chosen, but that was the point. Close enough to real, to be credible. Wrong enough to do damage. Impossible to refute. Without providing information the source knew she would not want to provide publicly. She sat up in bed. She read the article twice. She felt in sequence, cold, clear-headed, and absolutely certain about where it had come from. Her phone rang. "Elena." "I saw it," Nora said before Elena could speak. "The Upper East Side detail is from someone who knows about the Hale project," Elena said. "That list is very short. I know. He got it wrong enough to give himself cover, but right enough to land." "I know that too, Nora." Derek called 2 people I know this week trying to find out who your clients are. Names, projects, everything. That is not someone who has moved on. That is someone who is actively frightened of what you are becoming and is trying to cut it off before it gets too far. He is not frightened of me, Nora said. It came out automatic. Nora, he is terrified. You just cannot see it because you have spent 4 years learning not to see things about him that were true. Nora did not answer that. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. How far along are you? Elena asked. The shift in her voice was very small, the specific softening of someone who has been waiting to ask something and has finally decided the moment has arrived. Nora stopped moving. What? How far along are you? Elena said again. I have known for about a month. You are not drinking. You are carrying differently. You left the Henderson site visit early because of nausea and told Jamie it was a migraine. I have had 2 children, Nora. I know what I am looking at. The kettle started to hiss. Nora stood very still in her kitchen. 15 weeks, she said finally. The silence on Elena's end was the specific silence of someone absorbing information they had suspected but not confirmed. Then, does he know? No. Nora, I know. You need to tell him. If he finds out through someone else, or if you are further along and he feels like he was kept out of something deliberately, that is going to be much harder to come back from than an honest conversation. Nora poured the hot water over her tea bag. She stood at the counter and watched the water change color. Okay, she said. Okay, you will tell him? Yes, when? Soon. This week. Nora. Elena's voice was firm and kind in equal measure. Not soon. Now. Call him today. Nora held the cup. The tea was too hot to drink. She held it anyway. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from Marcus. I saw the piece. Do you want to talk before it gets worse? She stared at the message. Then a second one came through, 30 seconds after the first. For the record, the detail about the Upper East Side project is fabricated. I will have my communications team issue a correction this morning. She read that one twice. Then she picked the phone back up and typed, Thank you. Can we meet tomorrow? The response came in under a minute. Yes. Morning or afternoon? She typed, Morning, my studio. 9 o'clock. He wrote back, I will be there. She put the phone down. She picked up her tea. She went to her window and looked out at the city, and she thought, tomorrow. Tomorrow I will say it. Out loud in my own words. No interruptions. No moment that gets away. She drank her tea. She got dressed. She went to work. Chapter 4. What Marcus heard that night, and the question he should not have asked. She had rehearsed it. Not the words exactly. She had learned enough about herself to know that scripted conversations never went the way the script said, but the shape of it, the essential facts in the right order, without too much framing around them, without the kind of careful setup that made simple information sound like a negotiation. She had lain awake until 1 a.m. working out the shape, and then she had slept, and when she woke up she felt something close to resolved. Not calm. Resolved. She was at the studio by 8. She made coffee, straightened the boards on the north wall that did not need straightening, and sat at her desk with her hands flat on the surface. You have done harder things than this. You sat across a table from Derek's lawyers for 4 months. You fought for the Whitmore light fixtures when 3 people told you it was impossible. You have done considerably harder things than telling the truth to someone who has given you no reason to believe he will receive it badly. Marcus arrived at 5 minutes to 9. When Jamie offered coffee, he declined with a quiet thank you and came to where Nora was standing near the north wall. Thank you for coming, she said. Of course. He looked at her steadily. How are you? I am angry about the article, she said, and I am fine. Both of those are true. He nodded. He looked at the boards on the wall for a moment, just giving her space to begin. There is something I need to say, she said. 2 things, actually. And I want to say the second one first, because it is what I should have said before now, and if I do the first thing first, I will talk myself out of it again. He looked at her. He was very still. She took a breath. She said it simply, without the framing, without the setup, the way you say something when you have waited long enough that the only thing left is the truth in its plainest form. I am pregnant. 15 weeks. You are the father. I have known since before I took your commission, and I should have told you before the walkthrough, and the reason I did not was not strategic. It was fear. I was afraid you would think I had an angle. I was afraid you would look at me like someone who came with a plan. She stopped. She held his gaze. The silence that followed was not comfortable, and she had not expected it to be. She watched him process it, actually work through it, which she could see in the small, specific changes in his face. Something moved behind his eyes. His jaw tightened slightly, and then released. He looked away from her for exactly 4 seconds, and then back. 15 weeks, he said. Yes. You have known since before the commission came through. Yes, I found out at 11 weeks. The inquiry came in a week later. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even and controlled. Why did you not tell me at the walkthrough, or after? We have had several conversations. There were moments. I know, she said. There was one at dinner where I started to say it, and then your phone rang and the moment passed. That is not an excuse. The phone was not the reason. The reason was that I have spent 4 years in a situation where needing something from someone got used against me. And I know you are not Derek, but the instinct does not care who is in the room. It just fires. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, before I say anything else, I want to tell you something. She waited. I was at the Whitmore Gala, he said. I told you I admired the lobby, which was true. What I did not tell you was that I was standing near the bar when Derek spoke to you. I heard exactly what he said. I heard the pause before he said different. I saw his face while he was doing it, and I recognized it, and I started to walk toward him. I stopped when I saw you turn and walk away because you clearly did not need anyone to do that for you. But I want you to know that I heard it, all of it, and I want you to hear me say the specific words. What he said was deliberate and cruel and wrong, and the pleasure he took in the precision of it told me everything I needed to know about him. Nora stood very still. She had not known he had heard the whole thing. She had not known he had started to walk toward Derek. She had not known, until this moment, what it felt like to have someone tell her they had witnessed one of the most humiliating moments of the past 2 years and had seen it clearly, without minimizing it, without qualifying it, without finding some way to make it partly her fault. Something moved in her chest, something she had been holding carefully in place for a very long time. How long have you known? She asked. Her voice was quieter than she intended. Since that night, he said. I knew who Derek was professionally, the connection to you, the divorce, the gala, the commission. I have been aware of the full picture for several weeks, and you did not say anything. You did not seem like someone who wanted to be managed, he said. And I was not sure what you wanted from me, if anything. So if I waited, I was probably wrong to wait. She absorbed that. We have been very careful with each other, she said. Yes, that ends today, she said, clearly. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. Then his expression settled back into something more serious, and she could see him working toward something. He said, I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I am asking it because of who I am and what has happened to me before, not because of who you are. I know the difference, but I need to ask it. She waited. The pregnancy, he said, the timing of the commission, coming to my apartment. Was any part of this something you were planning to use? The words landed with a specific, precise weight that came from knowing exactly where to place them. She felt it move through her from the top of her head, down through her chest and into her stomach, where the baby was, where the evidence of the absolute opposite of a plan had been living for 15 weeks. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze. He did not flinch from it, which she noticed, and which made it worse and better at the same time. Worse because he was fully present for what he had just said. Better because he was not pretending he had not said it. No, she said, it was not. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. She put on her coat slowly and without any performance of hurt, because she was not going to perform hurt for anyone. Not in this room, not for this man, not anymore. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle and turned back, because there was one more thing and she needed him to have it. I understand why you asked, she said. I do. I understand it comes from something real that happened to you and that it is not about me specifically, but I need you to understand what it means to me to hear it. I have spent 4 years in a marriage where wanting anything was treated as evidence of an agenda. I have spent 2 years after that marriage building something, this studio, these clients, this life, specifically so that I would never again be in a position where someone could look at me and see a calculation instead of a person. And the first time I tell the truth to someone when it would have been easier not to, the question I get is whether I had a plan. I do not have a plan, Marcus. I have a 15-week pregnancy and a business I built by myself and a deep, considered, unfortunately real respect for the way you think. That is what I have. She opened the door and walked out. Nora went to the small back room she used for private calls and sat down in the chair by the window. She had held it together in that room. She had said everything she needed to say, and she had walked out with her head up. She knew that, but sitting alone in that small room, with the window showing her a narrow slice of gray October sky, something in her finally let go of the composure it had been gripping all morning. Not sobs, not the dramatic kind, just her eyes filling slowly, against her will, and her breath catching once, and her pressing her fingers against her mouth until it passed. Because she had told the truth. She had finally, completely told the truth to someone, and the first thing that happened was someone doubted it. She sat there until the feeling moved through her. It took about 4 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called Elena. Elena picked up immediately. How did it go? I told him, Nora said, and he told me about the gala, about hearing Derek, about knowing the full picture. He was honest about all of it. And then he asked me if the pregnancy was something I was planning to use. The silence on Elena's end had a particular quality to it. The specific silence of someone restraining an immediate response out of care for the person they were talking to. Nora, Elena said finally. I know. Are you all right? Nora looked at the window. At the narrow slice of sky, I cried, she said, for about 4 minutes, by myself in the back room. Good, Elena said, and her voice was gentler than Nora had heard it in a long time. You are allowed to do that. I told him what it cost me to hear it, Nora said. And then I left. That was exactly right. It does not feel exactly right, Nora said. It feels like I told the truth for the first time in a long time, and the first thing that happened was someone doubted it. Yes, Elena said, that is what it feels like. And it is also not the end of the story. Nora was quiet for a moment. I know that too. He is going to have to come back from that question, Elena said. That is his responsibility, not yours. You did your part. Marcus sat in the back of his car on West 22nd Street for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he was looking at the clock on his phone, watching the numbers move, giving himself a fixed container of time so that the thinking had an edge to it. He had asked her the wrong question. He knew that immediately, not slowly, not in stages, but in the specific way you know something you do not want to know with the sinking clarity of absolute certainty. He had seen her face when the words landed, and what he had seen was not guilt, not calculation. What he had seen was pain. The specific recognizable pain of someone who has been asked to prove something that should not require proof. He knew what that looked like. He had been wrong about it before, in the other direction, had believed the display of hurt when it was performance. This was not performance. He knew the difference. He had asked the question anyway, because his instincts were not as repaired as he had told himself they were, and because trust, real trust, not the professional version, was still the thing he was worst at. He thought about what she had said, the words she had chosen. I have a 15-week pregnancy and a business I built by myself and a deep, considered, unfortunately real respect for the way you think, unfortunately real. He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. The unfortunately was the part that undid him. It was not the word of someone who was managing a situation. It was the word of someone who was being honest about something they would have preferred not to feel. His phone rang. His head of business development, David Chen. Marcus, I need a direction on the Caldwell Group file. 22 months in review, and Caldwell has been making contact through 3 different channels. I need to handle it correctly. Marcus thought about Derek Calloway at the Whitmore Gala. The deliberate pause, the smile that stayed in place. He thought about Nora's face when she said, I have spent 4 years in a marriage where wanting anything was treated as evidence of an agenda. Send the decline, Marcus said. David paused. Full decline, full decline. Today, draft it professionally. No elaboration. Understood. I will have it out this afternoon. He ended the call. He sat for another 3 minutes. He thought about the fact that Derek Calloway had spent 22 months trying to get into a room with him, and that 22 months of proposals and carefully worded follow-ups were going to be answered this afternoon with a single formal letter, and that Derek would have no way of knowing that the decision had been building since the night of the Whitmore Gala, finalized in the time it took Marcus to watch a woman walk out of a studio because he had asked her a question he should have known better than to ask. He thought about the photograph on his desk, the angle of it. The decision about the light, he thought, the right decision made from real knowledge, taken at real risk, deserved more than a question about motives. I have to fix this, not with a gesture, not with a check, with something real, he said to his driver. Office. The car moved uptown through the city. Chapter 5-3. Conversations that close everything. Part 1. Derek. The formal decline from Hale Capital arrived at the Caldwell Group offices at 2:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. Derek's assistant brought it to him personally. She set it on his desk without comment and left the room. Derek read it once. Then he read it again. It was 2 paragraphs. The language was professional and entirely without warmth, not hostile, not apologetic, simply final. Hale Capital had reviewed the Caldwell Group's proposal and determined it was not a fit for their current investment priorities. They wished the Caldwell Group well in its future endeavors. There was no door left open, no suggestion of timing. It was the specific, careful language of an organization that had made a permanent decision and wanted to be unambiguous about it. 22 months. He sat with that number. 22 months of proposals and follow-up calls and carefully worded emails. 22 months of keeping the Hale Capital possibility alive in conversations with his institutional clients as evidence that the fund's future was secure. And now 2 paragraphs. He picked up his phone and called Garrett, a mid-level associate at Hale Capital who had, over 2 years, become something close to a source. Garrett picked up on the 4th ring. I just received the decline letter, Derek said, without preamble. I know, Garrett said. I need to understand the reasoning. 22 months of review does not end in a form letter without a specific reason. A pause. Then, quietly, there was a comment from Mr. Hale himself when the file came for final review. He said he had some strong feelings about your relationship with a designer named Nora Calloway. That was the phrase, strong feelings. He did not elaborate. Chen closed the file. The silence on Derek's end lasted long enough that Garrett said, "Derek?" "Thank you," Derek said. He ended the call. He set the phone on his desk. He sat back and looked at the ceiling of his office, and he felt something move through him that he was not accustomed to feeling, not guilt. Something more structural than guilt. The feeling of a load-bearing wall turning out to be decorative. He had been moving pieces on a board for weeks. He had called in a favor with a journalist. He had positioned and maneuvered with the precise patient skill that had, over his career, reliably produced the outcomes he wanted. He had done all of this because Nora Calloway, standing across a room at the Whitmore Gala, looking composed and well-connected and entirely unbothered by his proximity, had frightened him in a way he would never have described as fear. And somewhere in the process of moving those pieces, he had not noticed that Marcus Hale was already on the board. He thought about the gala. He thought about what he had said and the way he had said it, and the people nearby. He thought about the bar on the east side of the room and whether he had looked over there, and what he might have seen if he had. He thought about the specific words he had chosen, letting himself go completely, said with a smile, in front of strangers. He thought about Marcus Hale standing 10 feet away, watching, listening, remembering. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he called his driver. "I am going downtown." The studio was on the 4th floor. He took the stairs. Jamie told him Nora was with a client and asked if he had an appointment. "Tell her Derek Calloway is here," he said. "She will see me." Nora appeared in the doorway. She was in her work clothes, dark trousers, a loose cream top that fell differently than her clothes used to fall, and she looked at him with an expression that was not angry and not welcoming and not surprised. "Derek, I would like 5 minutes." She opened the studio door wider. He followed her in. She closed the door behind them. She stood on one side of the long central table, and he stood on the other. "I got the decline letter from Hale Capital this afternoon," he said. "I know," she said. "Marcus told me." The use of the first name landed. He registered it carefully. "I called a contact at the firm," he said. "He told me Hale cited my relationship with you as the reason." "Relationship is a generous word for what we have," she said. "Nora, I need 6 months. 6 months of quiet. No contact between you and Hale about me or the fund. The firm can stabilize in 6 months if there is nothing actively working against us. After that, I am out of your life for good. I am not asking for anything except time." She looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her face. She reached down and picked up her phone from the table. She turned the screen toward him. On the screen was a text conversation. His name at the top. The messages below it were between Derek and a contact he recognized with a cold drop in his stomach, the journalist. The messages were detailed. They named the specific angle of the article, the specific false detail about the Upper East Side project, the specific framing that had been agreed on. He looked at the screen. He looked at Nora. "I have had this since the morning after the article ran," she said. "The person you used to plant the story did not encrypt their messages. They also had a conversation with a mutual contact of mine who thought I should know. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to leave this studio. You are not going to contact me, my clients, my staff, or anyone connected to my professional life again. Not in 6 months, not in 6 years, not ever. If you do, this goes to every trade publication and legal contact I have, along with a full account of the pattern of behavior that preceded it. That is not a negotiation. That is what happens. Derek looked at the phone. He looked at the messages, his words, the specific traceable evidence of a decision he had made, believing he was managing a situation. He opened his mouth. There was always a response. He had built a career on always having a response. But he stood there in front of Nora Calloway's long work table, and what came out of his mouth was nothing. He looked at her one more time. He looked at the studio around her, the boards on the walls, the materials, the evidence of 2 years of work done entirely on her own terms. And something crossed his face that was the specific expression of someone who has run the numbers and arrived at an answer they do not have a counter-argument for. He said, very quietly, without any inflection at all, "I used to think you needed me to be taken seriously in this city. I can see now I had that exactly backward." It was not an apology. It was not offered as one. It was simply the last true thing left to say, the residue of calculation after everything else had been stripped away. Then he picked up his coat and he walked to the door and he left. Nora stood at the table for a moment after the door closed. She heard the outer door and then nothing. She looked at her phone and turned the screen off and put it in her pocket. She felt, more than anything, tired, not the tired of defeat, the tired of something that has been requiring effort for a very long time and is now, definitively, requiring nothing more. She stood there and let herself feel it, the weight of it and the relief of it at the same time, both present, both real. She had not cried. She had not needed to. She had simply told him what would happen, and it had happened, and now it was done. She opened the side door and went back to work. Part 2. Nora and Marcus. He came to the studio that evening. She was still there at 6:30 when she heard the knock at the studio door. Marcus was in his dark coat, no tie, the same coat he had been wearing that morning when she told him about the pregnancy and he had asked the wrong question. He was holding nothing. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "I am not here to apologize with a speech," he said. "I want to be clear about that up front." She looked at him. "Then why are you here?" "Because I owe you something more specific than an apology." "Can I come in?" She stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood near the center of the room and looked at her with the full, undistractable attention that was just how his mind worked when he was paying attention to something he considered worth it. "I sent the decline to the Caldwell Group yesterday afternoon," he said. "I want you to know that, not because it changes what I said to you this morning, but because I want the full picture on the table. I know. You sent me a message. I also want you to know that the decision had been made before I came to your studio this morning, before our conversation. It was made the night of the gala. I watched Derek's face while he was speaking, and I knew from that moment that I was never going to be in business with him. That part had nothing to do with you." She folded her arms. "Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve the accurate sequence of events, not the version where I sent the decline as a gesture toward you. Those are separate things, and you should know they are separate." She looked at him. "Okay, that is still not what I came to say," he said. "I know," she said. "Say it." He was quiet for a moment. "I asked you a question this morning that I had no right to ask," he said. "Not because it came from nowhere. It came from somewhere real, from something that happened to me that I told you about at dinner, and I am not going to pretend the wound is not there. But I have learned, at significant cost, to tell the difference between a person who is performing honesty and a person who is actually being honest. And I knew the difference this morning. I knew it from the way you said unfortunately real, and I asked the question anyway because I am considerably better at understanding other people's behavior than I am at trusting it. That is a flaw. It is one I have been aware of for a long time and have not adequately corrected. And it cost you something this morning that you did not deserve to pay." The room was very quiet. Outside, Manhattan went about its business. Nora looked at him. She thought about the first night she had seen him, near the bar at the gala, identified as just a man she had not really looked at. She thought about the photograph clipped to the schematic. She thought about the quality of the silence at the coat check. She thought about dinner, and Ohio and I have been good at acquiring spaces, and not particularly good at inhabiting them. She thought about unfortunately real, and what it had cost her to say it, and what it meant that he had remembered it, word for word. What you said before you left, he continued, about spending 4 years where wanting anything was treated as evidence of an agenda, about building this studio so you would never again be in a position where someone looked at you and saw a calculation instead of a person. I want you to know that I heard that, not as information about your past, as information about what I had just done to you. She uncrossed her arms. She pulled out the chair nearest to her and sat down. Sit down, she said. He sat. Across the table from her, facing each other directly. I understood why you asked it, she said. I told you that this morning, and I meant it. I understand where it comes from. What I need you to understand is what it is like to be the person the question gets asked of. When you have spent 4 years being read wrong by someone who should have known you, and you finally tell the truth, and the first response is a question about your motives, it does not matter that the question comes from somewhere real. It lands the same way. I know, he said. I saw it land. I need you to understand it, she said. Not feel bad about it. Understand it. There is a difference, he held her gaze. The difference is that feeling bad is about me, he said. Understanding it is about you. Yes, she said. I understand it, he said. You told the truth when it would have been easier, by almost every measure, not to. You told me before the situation became undeniable. You gave me the information in the most direct way available to you, and my response was to take the one thing you were most afraid of, being read as someone with a plan, and put it on the table as a question. I understand what that cost you. I am not asking you to be fine about it. I am asking you to know that I understand it. Nora sat with that for a moment. Then she said, I cried in the back room after you left. I want you to know that. Not to make you feel worse, just because it happened, and I am not going to pretend it did not. He did not look away. I know, he said. I am sorry. Good, she said. And then, because she was being honest tonight, and intended to keep being honest, do not do it again. I will not, he said. I mean that. She believed him. Not because she was naive about people. She had given up naive about people sometime in year 2 of her marriage, but because she had learned, eventually, to trust her own reading of a room. And what she read in this room, across this table, was a person who was saying the true thing even when it required him to be clearly, specifically wrong. That was not common. She knew how rare it was. I am going to need you to be patient with me, she said. Not about the pregnancy, about the rest of it. Whatever this is, I am a person who takes a long time to trust things. Not because I am damaged, but because I am careful. I need that to be okay. It is okay, he said. You have to mean that. Not as something you say, as something you are prepared to live with. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I have been patient with investments that took 7 years to produce anything. I have been patient with processes that other people abandoned. Patience is not what I lack. It is what I do with the time while I am being patient that I need to improve. She almost smiled. That is a very Marcus Hale way of putting it. I know, he said. And then, quietly, with the specific honesty of someone who has run out of reasons to protect themselves from it, I was nervous. At dinner, I am telling you that because you said it and I did not confirm it, and it was true, and you deserved confirmation. The man who built half the financial infrastructure of Lower Manhattan was nervous at dinner, she said. That man has a poor record with personal judgment, Marcus said. He was nervous. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she got up and made 2 cups of coffee, the real kind that took 8 minutes, and brought them back to the table. He accepted it. They sat with the warmth of the cups between them, the studio quiet. "What do you want from this?" she asked, a real question, not an accusation. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to know you," he said. "Not the professional version, not the version that has been navigating this situation. The full version. I want to understand what you are building and why, and I want to be useful to it in some way, if you will let me. And I want to be part of whatever is happening in the next however long." 7 months, she said, "give or take." 7 months, he said. "Yes, that." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "This is going to be complicated," she said. "Most things worth doing are," he said. "I am going to make choices you do not agree with, and I need those choices to be mine. I understand that. And when I tell you something," she said, "I need you to receive it as true until you have a specific and concrete present reason to think otherwise. Not a general one, not a historical one, a specific, concrete, present reason." He looked at her. "That is fair and harder than it sounds." "I know," she said. "I am telling you anyway." "I know you are," he said. "That is the thing about you. You say the hard thing directly. Most people do not do that." 4 years of doing the opposite, she said. I ran out of patience for it. They sat for a while longer. They finished the coffee. Outside, the light had gone entirely, and the city was fully dark. At some point, the quality of the silence between them changed, not the careful silence of 2 people managing a situation. The other kind, the kind that does not need to be managed. Part 3. The opening. The opening of the Hale apartment was in February. Not a large event. Nora did not do large events, and Marcus had not suggested one. 12 people, late on a Saturday afternoon when the light through the south-facing windows did what she had promised it would do. Nora was 26 weeks along. She had stopped doing the mirror calculations. At some point in the past month, she had crossed a line she had not noticed crossing. From managing the visibility of the pregnancy to simply existing in it. On the other side of that line, she had found something she had not expected. Ease. Not about everything. Not about the next 7 months or the 7 years after that or the 10,000 practical questions that she and Marcus were still, carefully, working through together. Just about this. About the fact of it. About the specific rightness of a child who was being waited for rather than accommodated. The apartment had turned out well. Better than well. It had turned out the way things turn out when the person who commissions the work and the person who does it have spent enough time talking to understand what the work is actually for. The rooms were warm and clear. The light fell the way light was supposed to fall, and there was not a single surface in the apartment that looked like it had been chosen to impress someone who was not there. She was standing near the kitchen, the stone she had argued for, which caught the late afternoon sun and turned a color she had known it would turn and had not been able to fully explain in advance, talking to the photographer from an architecture magazine. When Marcus came in from the front hallway, he had been caught on a call. She had known he would be. He shrugged out of his coat, handed it to someone, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the main living space. Just standing there, looking at the room. She watched him look at it. She had designed hundreds of spaces. She had stood in many of them after completion and watched the person they were built for encounter them in their finished form. She knew the difference between the polite appreciation of someone who got what they paid for and the involuntary expression of someone who walked into a room and recognized something in it that they did not know they had been missing. She knew which one this was. Elena appeared at Nora's elbow with the quiet efficiency she deployed in moments she had identified as significant. "The stone is extraordinary," she said. I told you it was too warm, and I was wrong. I am telling you that directly. You said it was too warm, Nora said. It is too warm, Elena said. It is also exactly right. Both of those things are true. You can be too warm and exactly right at the same time. Now stop talking to me and go be with your person. He has been looking for you for 30 seconds. Nora turned. Marcus was moving through the room with a direction to it. He reached her. Sorry, he said. The call ran long. I know. You made it. I always make it, he said. I know that too, she said. That is why I said it. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past 3 months, with the full attention, but also with something else now that had not been there at the beginning. Something that had come in gradually, the way light comes into a room when someone has thought carefully about where to put the windows. He put his hand on the small of her back, not for anyone else's benefit, just to be there, just present. She did not move away. She finished what she was saying to the photographer, and then she turned, and they stood together and looked at the room she had made. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, low and meant only for her, I want to tell you something. All right, she said. I have been in a lot of rooms in this city, he said. Rooms built to impress, rooms built to intimidate, rooms built to signal something about the person who owns them. I have sat in all of those rooms and felt nothing except a faint awareness that I was supposed to feel something. I walked in here 20 minutes ago, and the first thing I thought was, I want to stay. He paused. I am not talking about the apartment. She looked at him. I know you are not talking about the apartment, she said. I know you know, he said. I am saying it anyway, because you told me once that you need people to say the true thing directly, and I am trying to be that kind of person. For you specifically, I am trying very hard to be that. She felt something move in her chest. That specific, almost unbearable feeling of being known, of being seen not as a version of yourself you have carefully assembled, but as the actual thing. She had spent 4 years not having that. She had spent 2 years after that, telling herself she did not need it. She was standing here now in a room she had built, 26 weeks along, next to a man who had just said, I want to stay, and then clarified that he was not talking about the apartment, and she could feel the truth of it settle into her the way good light settles into a good room. Not dramatic, not sudden, just quietly, completely right. You built something good here, he said. Low, quiet, meant only for her. She looked at the room. She thought about 8 months of light fixture arguments and the Whitmore lobby and a photograph taken at an angle no one chose for promotion. She thought about 15 weeks and the back room and a cup of chamomile tea and 4 minutes of crying she had allowed herself and then put away. She thought about unfortunately real and patient with investments, and I was nervous and I want to stay. She looked at Marcus. She took his hand. She said, yeah, I think I did. Outside, the city went on doing what it did, indifferent, relentless, vast, and in its vastness, somehow making room for every particular and ordinary and extraordinary thing happening inside every lit window, inside the light held. End of story.